Okay, I want you to take a deep breath for me. Now imagine stepping into a space where the air is incredibly stagnant, intensely humid, and just heavy with this thick suspension of cotton fibers. With absolutely every breath, your lungs are taking in particulate matter, and your senses are completely overwhelmed by the sharp, pervasive smell of rancid machine oil coating the floorboards. You know, this wasn't some kind of nightmare. This was the everyday, sensory reality of the 19th century factory. In today's explainer, we're going to reconstruct the physical microclimate of early industrialization, but we're not going to do it by looking at kings or politicians. Instead, we're stepping right onto the factory floor alongside the ordinary people who lived and very often died inside of it.
Think about what a workday means to you. Well, this eyewitness account from Frank Forrest back in 1850 completely shatters our modern assumptions. He reveals this world where time itself was entirely subjective, dictated strictly by the absolute control employers held over the working class. I mean, to carry a watch was to carry a direct threat to the master's authority. This artifact really introduces us to a system where everyday existence was stripped of all personal autonomy and entirely subjugated to the rhythm of the machine.
So over the next few minutes, we are undertaking a rigorous forensic reconstruction of the Victorian factory. We aren't just looking at what people did, we're examining the historical evidence to understand exactly how the transition from an agrarian, daylight-dependent economy to steam-driven capitalism fundamentally restructured the human body, daily life, and the very concept of time itself. We're going to explore the severe constraints that shape these workers' choices and the immense, overpowering systems that govern their survival.
Let's start by exploring the actual physical space of the factory floor, a technologically dense and psychologically demanding institution.
You see, the architectural and environmental choices of these buildings were absolutely not accidental. They were designed strictly to optimize the machinery's performance, deliberately compromising human health in the process. The buildings were sealed incredibly tight because even a slight draft could cause a rapid temperature drop. The extreme heat and dampness, that was maintained specifically to prevent the cotton threads from snapping. So the workers inside were forced to labor in a state of chronic oxygen deprivation, breathing in a toxic suspension of heavy dust, all while enduring the deafening, relentless mechanical noise of the steam-powered mule jennies.
That physical environment was paired with a completely new psychological weapon, the tyranny of time.
Time was no longer measured by the natural rising and setting of the sun, but by the shriek of the factory whistle. And punctuality was violently enforced through punitive measures like quartering. Basically, if a worker was just 15 minutes late, they immediately forfeited an entire half hour of their wages. This was an extraordinarily harsh financial penalty imposed on a workforce living on the very edge of starvation. And remember, as we noted earlier, most of these people couldn't even afford to buy a clock.
Which brings us to the really devastating testimony of Elizabeth Bentley, given to a parliamentary committee in 1832. She explicitly notes, "We had no clock." This was a systemic, calculated mechanism for wage theft through temporal manipulation. Without personal timepieces, workers were entirely at the mercy of factory clocks, and masters would often secretly put those clocks forward in the morning to induce tardiness and then turn them back at night to extract unpaid labor. Bentley was earning merely a penny an hour, yet a minor delay cost her a half penny.
So, how long were they actually subjected to this kind of control? Well, by 1819, 14 to 15 hours constituted the standard daily hours of actual labor in these factories. That is 72 to 74 hours a week of crushing, relentless physical endurance required just to merely survive. It's a staggering temporal demand that completely consumed the workers' waking lives.
This naturally leads us to the demographic cornerstone of early industrial labor. And, frankly, the most heartbreaking part of this history, the working-class children. The daily existence of these children was a horrifying reality. They weren't just hired because they were a source of cheap labor. They were exploited specifically for their small stature. They were required to navigate the lethal, incredibly narrow spaces beneath operating, reciprocating machinery, spaces that adult bodies quite simply could not reach. There was this specific, highly dangerous labor hierarchy assigned to parish apprentices and impoverished youth. The youngest, sometimes just 6 or 7 years old, were scavengers. They were instructed to glue their heads and bodies to the floor to sweep up loose cotton while hissing heavy machinery passed directly over their dizzy heads. Piecers constantly leaned over moving frames to repair threads, and doffers had to rapidly replace bobbins. Any mistake, or even just showing a sign of drowsiness, carried the ever-present threat of the overlooker's strap or being dipped headfirst into a freezing iron water cistern. 20. That number represents the miles walked in a single day by a child picer. In 1836, John Fielden, who was a member of Parliament and actually a factory owner himself, was so skeptical of these reports regarding child exhaustion that he literally stood in his own factory with a clock and tracked the child's movements. To his absolute surprise, he calculated that the distance the child moved back and forth along the spinning mules was no short of 20 miles in a single shift.
We have to analyze the devastating physiological consequences of this chronic industrial exposure.
The historical record really forces us to confront horrifying eyewitness accounts like this one from John Allett. Remember, these are severely exhausted children working 14-hour days around completely unfenced high-speed mechanical belting. When exhaustion met unregulated machinery, the results were literally lethal. Accounts like this impartially document a grim, everyday reality, where injured workers were often just abandoned. The moment an accident occurred, their wages stopped instantly with zero compensation.
And beyond the mechanical trauma, there were profound chemical hazards. Have you ever heard of phossy jaw? It was an occupational disease primarily suffered by young women and girls in match factories who were exposed to white phosphorus. This toxic chemical disrupted bone metabolism, literally causing the jawbone to die and separate from living tissue, leading to complete facial collapse. Medical history records the chilling detail that the embedded phosphorus sometimes caused their gums and dead bone to emit a faint greenish-white glow in the dark. It stands as one of the most extreme cases of chemically induced skeletal degeneration ever documented.
But the damage wasn't always as glaringly visible as phossy jaw. When we synthesize modern academic findings, anthropometric data, which is the measurement of human bodies, reveals widespread physical stunting among the Victorian working class. The extreme caloric demands of factory labor, combined with the energy required to fight off infections in unsanitary slums, actively suppressed the physical growth of an entire generation. Their bodies literally stopped growing just to survive the factory.
So why did they do it? Let's take a step back and examine the overarching economic structures that trapped families in this grueling cycle.
A huge factor here was the truck system. Even when nominal wages seemed somewhat adequate on paper, they were heavily manipulated in practice. Laborers were frequently paid in script or tokens rather than actual cash. These Tommy notes could only be redeemed for basic sustenance at company-owned Tommy shops, which were notoriously, deliberately overpriced. This essentially forced laborers to return their hard-earned wages directly back to their employers just to get food.
This actually brings us to a really fascinating scholarly division known as the standard of living debate, which we want to present here completely impartially. On one side, you have economic optimists who point to data showing that adult, skilled weavers operating power looms could eventually earn enough to buy about 30 pounds of bread a day. But on the other side, biological pessimists argue that this raw economic purchasing power is completely negated by the undeniable forensic evidence. The extreme physical stunting, the horrific occupational diseases, and the systemic forced labor of children. The argument is, what good is all that bread if the human body is fundamentally broken?
Eventually, the state attempted to intervene. Let's trace the legislative attempts to regulate this laissez-faire crucible. What you see here is the slow, incredibly hard-fought progression of parliamentary reform known as the Factory Acts. It kicked off in 1833 by finally banning the employment of children under 9. By 1844 and 1847, they slowly chipped away at the hours, finally achieving the 10 Hours Act for women and children. And by 1850, they established a normal day, which finally set rigid spatial and temporal boundaries on industrial capital, legally stipulating that work could only occur between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. But we have to clarify that writing a law absolutely did not stop the abuses overnight. Factory owners ruthlessly exploited loopholes to maintain the relentless, profitable pace of steam production. They used complex relays of children to keep the machines running far beyond the legally allowed hours for any individual child. Plus, adult men were completely excluded from early protections, meaning they might still labor for 15 hours. And here is perhaps the wildest fact: that groundbreaking 1833 Act, it was initially enforced by a grand total of just 4 inspectors for the entire British nation. 4, which of course made the widespread use of fake age certificates ridiculously easy.
Wrapping up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really reflect on. As we look at the incredible conveniences of our modern mechanized lives, the mass production, the standard of living we enjoy right now, we have to weigh them against the forensic evidence of the immense suffering that built them. When you consider the stunted growth, the severed limbs, and the stolen time of ordinary men, women, and children, one profound historical question remains:
Were the foundations of our modern world truly worth the biological and human cost extracted from the Victorian working class?